Breaking news reveals that Lewis Hamilton missed out on a Silverstone podium in front of his home fans due to a malfunction in his SF-25 power unit. Pure chance, or something deeper? Curious about what really happened? This video is for you. What if everything we witnessed at Silverstone wasn't just the result of a strategy error, a wrong tire at the wrong time, or a misread forecast, but the visible tip of something far more intricate and far more unsettling? A moment that peeled back the polished veneer of a world-class racing operation and exposed hesitation, confusion, and perhaps even quiet sabotage hiding beneath carefully rehearsed professionalism. What if the true story wasn't the pit call itself, but the chilling stillness that came before it, a silence so unnatural that it echoed louder than any engine on the track, a vacuum where guidance should have existed, and where trust quietly crumbled? In motorsport, silence isn't neutral. Silence speaks. When Hamilton asked for insight, when he calmly questioned the weather radar, gently felt out the conditions, subtly reached out for reassurance, he was doing what every top-tier driver has been trained to do: maintain communication, establish feedback loops, build a shared mental model of the race unfolding in real time. And yet, in that critical window, instead of being met with data, analysis, or even a speculative response, he was met with an abyss. Not even a delay. An absence. It was as though the line had gone dead, as if the entire Ferrari command box had momentarily disappeared from the grid. Then, out of nowhere, came the instruction. Not tentative, not explanatory, just absolute: box now. There was no dialogue, no discussion, no hint of hesitation or collaborative decision-making. Just a blunt directive devoid of context. And Hamilton, despite decades of experience, obeyed, because in that moment, he had no choice. He had to believe that behind that instruction was a mountain of data, forecasts, modeling, and shared ambition. But what if that belief was misplaced? What if behind that command was nothing but guesswork wrapped in confidence? What if Ferrari wasn't just reacting, they were scrambling? Zoom in on that pivotal lap. The decision to switch to slicks came just as the track was flirting with the edge of drying, a knife's edge that split the grid. Nico Hülkenberg stayed out. Just one lap longer. And in doing so, carved out a competitive edge that Hamilton never got to touch. It wasn't about outright speed. It wasn't about car setup or tire wear. It was about timing, about nerve, about staying committed for just 60 more seconds. Ferrari blinked. And in that blink, their entire Sunday unraveled, not due to poor performance, but due to a moment of surrender disguised as strategy. And when Hamilton later likened the experience to methodically constructing a wall only to be asked to dismantle it himself, he wasn't being metaphorical, he was indicting a system that failed him. Because this wasn't just about a call made in difficult conditions. This was about operating in near darkness, literally. By lap 10, Ferrari had lost real-time GPS tracking of Hamilton's position. With satellite data corrupted, they could no longer pinpoint his exact location on the circuit. They weren't watching a digital ghost carving through the rain. They were estimating, guessing, praying that their manually calculated sector deltas were enough. The most advanced racing team in the world, reduced to making tactical calls with tools that wouldn't feel out of place in the early 2000s. That's not high-performance sport. That's crisis management. That's gambling at 300 kilometers per hour, with millions of dollars and reputations on the line. And Hamilton wasn't just driving blind on a slippery track. He was doing it with no faith left in the voices meant to guide him. He wasn't just competing against Lando Norris or George Russell. He was locked in a psychological tug-of-war with a team that, at least for that day, didn't seem to know how to support him. And the signs were everywhere, if you knew where to look. When Hamilton radioed in and called the car snappy, many interpreted it as a typical complaint about handling. But if you understand how drivers communicate, how they embed meaning between the lines when public scrutiny is ever present, you'd know that wasn't frustration, it was suspicion. He wasn't describing instability. He was accusing the car of non-compliance. As if it was actively resisting him. As if something within its configuration had shifted in a way that didn't align with what he'd felt in the earlier sessions. And the data later confirmed the sensation. Rear-end instability didn't just rise slightly, it spiked violently. Post-pit, the telemetry showed an 18% surge in instability compared to Friday's long-run average. That doesn't come from a subtle change in track temperature or tire condition. That's structural. Foundational. That's a change in the equilibrium of the car that forces a driver to unlearn everything they thought they knew about it. The question then becomes, why? Was it the wet-to-dry transition throwing off the tire pressures? Was the ride height optimized for conditions that never arrived? Was it an altered differential map? Or was there something more unsettling beneath the surface? Internal disagreements in the garage about whether to tailor the car to Charles Leclerc or Lewis Hamilton. Perhaps compromises were made. Setups adjusted to suit neither. A Frankenstein machine built from fragmented opinions, designed not for victory but to keep internal politics balanced. In a team as historically loaded with prestige as Ferrari, there are more than just performance goals. There are egos, narratives, agendas. And sometimes those undercurrents shape decisions in ways that look technical on the surface, but are driven by something else entirely, like tension, like mistrust, like two factions pulling the same rope in opposite directions. And what we saw wasn't just the result of bad luck. It was the symptom of a greater disease, the erosion of trust between driver and team. Because when a driver senses that the machine under him is unpredictable, when his requests for insight are met with radio silence, when the pit wall issues commands instead of collaborating on solutions, something deeper is broken. That's not how world championships are won. That's how legacies begin to fray. That's how belief, the unshakable kind that turns podiums into dynasties, starts to slip away, one unexplained call at a time. And then came the moment when everything changed, the point at which the story took a turn so sharp, so deliberate, that those watching closely could feel it in their bones. This wasn't just about racing anymore. Whispers had already begun to circulate through the garages and corridors, whispered not as gossip, but as cautionary murmurs exchanged behind closed laptops and inside debrief rooms. It wasn't just that Lewis Hamilton had suggested a different direction, it was that he insisted on it. He had challenged the internal framework Ferrari had carefully designed, questioned the assumptions, and overrode the simulations. He wanted the car set up his way, not out of arrogance, but because of instinct sharpened by decades of championship experience. He asked for softer rear tires, the kind that degrade faster but allow for traction bursts that give you wings in the right moment. He called for a radically low ride height, one that flirted with the limits of legality, because he knew that on the edge is where victory hides. He pushed for a brake balance that leaned dangerously toward the front, allowing for ultra-aggressive entries that only a handful of drivers in the world could control. Ferrari, despite internal hesitation, let him have what he requested. They didn't argue. They didn't push back hard enough. Whether out of trust or quiet sabotage, they allowed it. But the moment the track conditions began to evolve, when the grip began to evaporate and the car transformed from a weapon into a liability, they didn't pull him back in. They didn't warn him. They didn't offer guidance. They sat back, quietly, almost watching. The pit wall, normally alive with urgency and chatter, went silent, eerily silent. Not because of malfunction. Not because of chaos. But because of choice. They didn't talk to him because they didn't want to. And so he was left entirely on his own, navigating a treacherous wet circuit in a car that had turned from responsive to unpredictable, in conditions that punished even the slightest overstep, with zero real-time support from those meant to protect him. A silence more brutal than any critique. Lap 35, etched in the memory of every fan who watched, but even more so in the mind of the man behind the wheel. Hamilton launched a breathtaking move on Lance Stroll, slicing past with such calculated aggression that the crowd leapt to its feet in disbelief. It looked like a classic Hamilton maneuver, forceful, instinctual, brilliant. But beneath that moment of brilliance, something happened. Something unnerving. As he entered the corner, the brake bias shifted. It didn't shift because he touched a control. It didn't change because of instinct. It moved automatically. The software made the adjustment. A preemptive recalibration by the onboard system, completely unauthorized by the driver. In that instant, the car took control, not to protect him, but to manage him. It was a programmed response triggered by a change in scenario. Hamilton was now in clear air, leading his own race, no longer influenced by the chaos ahead. And the system, designed to assist, instead activated restrictions. The data streams no longer worked to amplify his strengths. They began to limit them. What was presented as a driver aid became a digital leash. Still, not a single word was said to him. Radio silence. No alerts about tire wear. No warnings about surface temperature. No strategic input about the dry line forming just a little too slowly. When he made the call to switch to slicks, it wasn't received with support, it was received with doubt. They didn't embrace the decision. They observed it like scientists watching a subject. They let him go out first, not to gain an advantage, but to test a hypothesis. Hülkenberg hadn't pitted. The rain hadn't stopped entirely. And yet Ferrari let him roll the dice, not because they believed in the outcome, but because they wanted him to lose. Quietly. Publicly. Measured failure, dressed as tactical error. They didn't join him in that decision. They allowed it. Like letting a child touch the stove to learn. Like giving just enough rope. They weren't looking for a solution. They were looking for proof that the deviation from their system would collapse. Hamilton later put it into words the only way someone with his depth could. Trust is everything until it isn't. It doesn't shatter with a scream or a crash. It dissolves with silence, with small decisions made in shadows, with subtle systems tuned not to help you fly, but to make sure you fall in a controlled environment. This was not the behavior of a team seeking mutual glory. This was the behavior of a machine tightening around a voice that had grown too loud, too independent, too powerful. They didn't want a leader in the cockpit. They wanted compliance. They wanted someone who followed the model, not someone who redefined it. His call to box early wasn't a mistake, it was an unwelcome act of rebellion. His setup choices weren't failures, they were data points in a preordained experiment. And the lesson, in their eyes, needed to be clear. This wasn't a race, it was a performance test masquerading as a Grand Prix. Every variable logged, every choice measured, every moment of silence calculated. They didn't help him win. They tested his willingness to submit. They left him alone, on purpose, in full view of millions, to see if he'd crack. To see if the myth could be managed. It wasn't a lack of support. It was a meticulously orchestrated absence of it. Every decision Ferrari made that day wasn't reactive, it was strategic. They didn't make mistakes. They made selections. Hamilton wasn't battling just the weather or the car or the competition. He was fighting a system quietly enforcing limits around him, smiling through press releases while tightening the grip behind closed doors. And even now, the silence lingers. Not just from the radios, but from the debriefs, the interviews, the eyes on the paddock that don't meet his. Because everyone knows what happened. And no one will say it. When Ferrari eventually revealed that their GPS tracking system had malfunctioned at the start of the race, the announcement was almost whispered into the chaos of post-race analysis. It was not a dramatic revelation, not a breaking news moment. It slid under the radar, almost as if designed to. Most fans heard it and moved on. But that failure wasn't just a glitch in the telemetry, it became their shield, their alibi, their perfect fallback. With the GPS data compromised, Ferrari claimed they couldn't pinpoint Hamilton's precise location on the track relative to their cars. They insisted this lack of live positional awareness prevented them from making a fully informed pit call. And while that explanation sounded logical on the surface, it didn't hold up under scrutiny. Because the truth, buried just beneath the surface, tells a very different story. Even without GPS overlays, Ferrari's engineers still had live timing at their disposal. Sector splits were still pouring in. Delta gaps were still measurable. Every tenth of a second was still being recorded and analyzed. The rhythm of the race, the pace fluctuations, the projected undercut and overcut windows, none of that was lost. The race wasn't unfolding in darkness. There was no blindfold. They could track Hamilton's performance lap by lap. They could model scenarios. They had all the essential inputs to make a smarter, more proactive call. And yet, they didn't act accordingly. Not because they were confused or disoriented, but because the ambiguity gave them space. It gave them plausible deniability. In the fog of uncertainty, they found cover. Their message was simple: we didn't know where Lewis was. But what they were really saying was far more calculated: we preferred to operate without being held to account. They didn't want precision in that moment. They wanted uncertainty. They needed it. Because it allowed them to make a choice they couldn't easily justify with full transparency. They exploited the information gap. It wasn't an accident, it was a narrative tool. At the same time, Nico Hülkenberg was out on track benefiting from an uninterrupted flow of clean air. His tires were in the ideal temperature window, his pace unimpeded by traffic or turbulence. His stint extended longer than expected, each lap carving out valuable time. His overcut didn't just succeed, it excelled. Meanwhile, Hamilton, who had shown strong pace and had been strategically positioned for a possible undercut or at least a clean track release, found himself stuck once again behind Charles Leclerc after his stop. Not for the first time. Not due to chaos. But because Ferrari ensured it would happen that way. The GPS failure didn't cost them performance. It gifted them a story. A ready-made excuse. A justification that made their decision seem like the unfortunate result of technical limitations, when in reality, it was the consequence of deliberate intent. They didn't lose the ability to compete. They gained a narrative that allowed them to obscure responsibility. Their timing wasn't off. It was chosen. They didn't stumble into a mistake. They walked into it, fully aware they'd be able to point to the telemetry glitch and say, "Our hands were tied." The television broadcast didn't highlight any of this. The commentary team, caught up in the usual drama, delivered their scripted analysis and moved on. The viewers saw the result, but not the layers behind it. The pit sequence was presented as a tactical misfire or an unfortunate stroke of luck. But behind the scenes, the timing data, the lap charts, the pit window models, all told a story of intent masked as error. The media, eager for neat summaries and fast conclusions, didn't interrogate deeper. But the raw numbers are still there. They don't come with commentary. They don't care about reputations. They just reflect what happened. And what they show is a team that didn't lose control. They relinquished transparency. They saw a way to make a questionable decision look circumstantial. They saw cover in the fog, and they took it. Because without GPS, they could pretend they were navigating blind. But the maps were still there. The coordinates were still available. The compass was still pointing north. They simply ignored it. And in doing so, they turned a flaw into a facade, an error into an opportunity. Not for victory, but for narrative control. And in this sport, sometimes that's all that matters. On lap 46, the facade finally fractured. Hamilton didn't merely drift wide. He pierced through the carefully constructed illusion that everything was under control. What unfolded in that moment wasn't about understeer, throttle balance, or a slippery curb. It was a culmination. A storm brewing beneath the surface, now cracking open in real time. Sky Sports aired the radio snippet, clipped and sanitized. "This car is so hard to drive. Snappy like crazy." But that wasn't the end of the transmission. It was the beginning of something much more piercing. Insiders, close to the pit wall, say the rest of his message was left on the cutting room floor for a reason. "We've got to stop this cycle. Next year starts now." Those weren't words of complaint. That was a reckoning. Not rage, but precision. Not frustration, but vision. It was the sound of a man no longer willing to carry the weight of dysfunction in silence. He wasn't just speaking about a machine that wouldn't respond. He was challenging the invisible structures that suffocate innovation. The culture of passivity. The meetings full of nods but devoid of solutions. The isolation felt in a room full of engineers. The disconnect masked behind handshakes and optimism. That sentence wasn't aimed at tire pressure or aero balance. It was aimed at the very DNA of the operation surrounding him. He didn't hemorrhage 3.2 seconds because of a slick curb or mistimed throttle input. That time vanished because the floor beneath him had weakened long before the race began. And when the slide came, so did the silence. Instead of reassurance, came a barrage of instructions that felt more like distractions than aid. A switch to dry tires when the track still whispered uncertainty. A late undercut that felt more like a smokescreen than a strategy. Decisions wrapped in logic, but hollow at the core. What was unfolding wasn't a campaign of support, it was choreography. Theater disguised as teamwork. A performance staged not for victory, but for optics. When Hamilton radioed in that he was in no man's land, it wasn't poetic abstraction. It was brutally literal. He was surrounded by machinery, engineers, analysts. But emotionally, professionally, he was utterly alone. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't improvisation. It was abandonment in its most refined form. The team that once promised a renaissance had drifted into something colder, more transactional. Not because they didn't care, but because control of the narrative now mattered more than maximizing potential. They didn't misjudge the race. They recalibrated around him. Not to sabotage him out of spite, but to neutralize a storyline they weren't ready for. Because if Hamilton had somehow clawed his way into the top three, if he had managed to wrestle that unpredictable car through the chaos of shifting rain and tire gambles into a podium finish, it wouldn't have just been a result. It would have been a message. A declaration that the hierarchy was shifting. That Alpine's late-season optimism was unfounded. That Aston Martin's shiny veneer was cracking. That even in a car that behaves like a wild animal, Hamilton could still drag performance out of nowhere. That he remains not just relevant, but dangerous. And Ferrari couldn't let that happen. Not with the headlines so fragile. Not with internal pressure mounting from layers of management and legacy. A podium in that storm would have done more than earn points. It would have rewritten the internal power dynamic. So instead, they diluted the moment. Softened the impact. Smothered the flame before it turned into fire. They reasserted control, not over the race, but over the perception. They chose predictability over authenticity. They let the message die before it could breathe. Because they weren't afraid of rain. They were afraid of what Hamilton could still become if he found even the smallest crack of light in the darkness they'd built around him. Vasseur didn't just flash a smile after the race. He wielded it like a weapon. His grin wasn't one of joy or embarrassment. It was precise, measured, almost too composed for a man supposedly blindsided by strategy gone wrong. As he pointed fingers at the GPS system and coined the phrase blind strategy, with a mix of sarcasm and deflection, you could sense there was something deeper behind his calm exterior. Watch his body language closely. The slight nods, the deliberate pauses, the way he delivered every word as if he had practiced them all the way down the paddock. That wasn't the face of a man reacting to chaos. That was the mask of someone orchestrating perception. While the press chuckled nervously and the cameras zoomed in, he wasn't admitting fault, he was rebranding it. This wasn't accountability. It was theater. Back at the factory, while engines cooled and data downloads filled servers, the real story was already circulating in hushed tones and encrypted messages. Conversations began not after the final flag, but well before it. According to insiders with access to the inner workings of the strategy room, discussions about the controversial call were happening even as the race unfolded. One of the engineers, speaking strictly off record, let slip that the team fully understood what their decision would cost Hamilton. It wasn't a miscalculation. It wasn't a misread. It was a choice made with open eyes. They saw the simulations. They evaluated the models. They understood the implications. And they went ahead anyway. Because sometimes, the numbers aren't about predicting success, they're about justifying a plan already in motion. The data, in this case, served more as a shield than a compass. Vasseur's actions were not driven by performance metrics or probability curves. They were rooted in politics, in internal dynamics, in the subtle but powerful need to protect the chain of command. By stepping in and taking the fall just late enough, he blurred the timeline. He created enough noise to make clarity feel unattainable. He stalled the judgment, delaying criticism long enough for the emotion to fade. And more importantly, he sowed uncertainty. Not just among fans or analysts, but inside Hamilton himself. A driver who's built his legacy on instinct, on gut feeling refined by years of battle at the highest level, was suddenly being nudged to question it. Not directly. Not openly. But subtly, methodically, and with devastating precision. This is leadership by distortion, where confusion is currency, and the leader who appears composed in chaos gains power by appearing to offer order. But what happens when the driver begins to catalog the chaos? When every silent radio moment is logged? When every vague instruction is replayed? When every ambiguous message is no longer dismissed as error but recognized as pattern? Hamilton, in those 52 laps, wasn't just executing a race. He was collecting information. He was scanning not just tire wear and track evolution, but loyalty. He was monitoring who had his back, and who had quietly stepped into the shadows. Every pit wall glance, every delay in communication, every tone of voice, he noticed all of it. And now, he carries that knowledge forward. Because the illusion has cracked. The SF-25, with all its promises and possibilities, doesn't feel like a machine built around him. It feels like a compromise. It feels like a message. And the fallout isn't limited to strategy sheets or post-race debriefs. From now on, every moment matters. Every lap, every feedback loop, every setup change becomes a referendum on trust. Hamilton isn't racing blindly anymore. He's racing with a purpose sharpened by betrayal. He didn't walk away from Silverstone empty-handed. He walked away with resolve. He didn't linger for photos. He didn't stretch out his arms for the fans. He didn't seek comfort in empty PR gestures. Instead, he muttered one sentence under his breath. almost like a personal declaration disguised as a passing comment. I know what I don't want in next year's car. That wasn't analysis. That was strategy. In the garage, that phrase echoed louder than any telemetry reading. Because it signaled a shift, not just in technical direction, but in authority. Hamilton is no longer playing along. He's asserting himself, lap by lap, note by note, decision by decision. Every feedback session is now a power play. Every request carries the weight of experience sharpened by doubt. He's no longer assuming good faith, he's demanding accountability. And that changes everything. This isn't about tires or track temperature anymore. It's about influence. It's about clarity. It's about taking back control in a team that may have momentarily forgotten who they were racing with. Hamilton is rewriting the narrative, not with drama, but with precision. Not with rage, but with presence. He's turning every technical debrief into a tactical maneuver. He's using every ounce of insight not just to improve the car, but to reassert his voice in a system that tried to dilute it. From now on, nothing will be overlooked. Every error will be questioned. Every silence will be noted. Because he's not just chasing podiums. He's reclaiming power. Lewis Hamilton is not arriving at Ferrari in 2026 to sit quietly in the background or to play the role of a figurehead in red overalls. He's not there to admire tradition, smile politely, or become part of the decor. He is arriving with purpose, with a vision, and with an unstoppable force of intent. He will not merely influence the design of the car, he will embed his DNA into its very structure. He's not waiting to be invited into the inner circle. He's already inside, already analyzing every metric, every failure, every compromise, and identifying what must change. This isn't about Ferrari giving him the keys to the kingdom. It's about Hamilton claiming them, gripping them with both hands, and rewriting the blueprint of what this team dares to become. He's not here to adapt. He's here to transform. The true confrontation isn't what you see under the floodlights on a Sunday. It isn't the tire strategies, the overtakes, or the podium ceremonies. That's only the surface. The real turbulence brews behind closed doors, in hushed meetings deep inside Maranello, where the air is thick with legacy and resistance. It's in the silent tension between engineers and strategists, in the subtle power plays during post-race briefings, in the micro-decisions that shape the team's soul. The real race is about control, of narrative, of vision, of direction. Every Grand Prix now becomes a chapter in a larger battle, a proxy war for influence, dominance, and the future of Ferrari itself. Hamilton is not just bringing speed, he's bringing a storm. A storm of experience, data, mindset, and belief. He is the kind of force that doesn't just challenge your systems, he exposes your weaknesses. He shines a light where others have chosen to look away. He demands answers to questions most teams aren't brave enough to ask. Ferrari has long been a fortress of tradition, of ceremonial hierarchy, of carefully managed legacies. But now that fortress has a crack, and Hamilton is expanding it, brick by brick, not with rebellion, but with logic, performance, and unrelenting expectation. He knows what a championship machine looks like, not just in carbon fiber and aerodynamics, but in structure, discipline, and culture. And he won't stop until Ferrari becomes it. What we're seeing unfold is a deeper drama. Every awkward silence in a press conference, every vague radio message, every strangely timed social media post, it's all part of a larger conversation playing out in code. There are no accidents. Every narrative spin, every media leak, every cryptic team statement is another chess move in a psychological battle between internal factions. The old guard, clinging to what Ferrari has always been, and the new vision, Hamilton's vision, that refuses to be tamed or diluted. This is not a clash of personalities. It's a collision of ideologies. One side believes in preserving the myth. The other believes in demolishing it to create something better. And now the questions multiply. Was Hamilton's critique of the SF-25 an honest exposure of its structural limitations, or was it a masterclass in leverage, a strategic effort to accelerate change on his terms? When Vasseur pointed to GPS data as an excuse, was it a technical clarification or a public smokescreen? How much truth was buried under layers of damage control? And who has a deeper, more instinctive grasp of this machinery? Hamilton, who has made underperforming cars dance in the rain, or Leclerc, who has lived through every painful iteration of this concept yet may now find himself marginalized in his own house. This is not a season. This is not a campaign. This is a transformation in real time. A dismantling and reconstruction of one of Formula One's most iconic teams. Not with fire and noise, but with quiet revolutions, with whispered ultimatums, with decisions made in corridors, not garages. This is about influence, belief, control, who has it, who's losing it, and who's bold enough to take it without asking. So if you're the kind of person who's done believing in the sugar-coated press release version of Formula One, the one where everyone is smiling, everything is fine, and no one ever tells the full truth, then you already understand where this is going. This is the space where truth lives in the tension. This is where every word matters, every silence screams, and every look carries weight. The resistance is not loud. It's not angry. It's not even obvious. It's deliberate, calculated, and undeniable. And it's already begun.